In this hint, we're going to talk about externalities. Now, what is an externality and when does it occur? Externalities are effects of an activity on parties other than the buyer and the seller, sometimes known as third parties. So, the interesting thing about externalities is they can be negative or they can be positive. If I run a manufacturing plant and I dump polluted water into a river, the parties downstream to me may have negative effects that I do not have to compensate them for, nor do my customers. So the buyer and seller of that activity are not affected, but third parties are. So that's a negative externality. It imposes an external cost. Let's say that I am a beekeeper and I keep bees, and the bees also visit the properties adjacent to my property. And perhaps there are apple orchards or other kinds of agricultural activities going on there that benefit from the pollination activities of my bees. The orchard has higher productivity, is able to offer its products at lower costs, so that seller and buyer benefits from my bees, and this is considered a positive externality. Let's take a look at the supply and demand graph in the presence of an externality. And we're going to be looking at a negative externality, otherwise known as an external cost. So, negative externality. So let's first look at the demand curve. This is a very typical downward sloping demand curve. We're going to be in this manufacturing industry that I talked about. So let's say that we're making steel, and we have this manufacturing plant that's dumping polluted water into the river. So our demand curve is our consumer demand for steel, has nothing to do with the cost of production. Looking now at the supply side, let's start with our green curve here, which is the marginal cost curve to this steel manufacturing facility. And the marginal cost curve here will also serve as our supply curve. I've got the P to denote that this is the private marginal cost. It's the private supply curve. Nothing to do with the social cost that's going to occur as a result of the pollution. Okay, so where's our equilibrium? In the private sector, it's going to be where demand equals this private supply curve or marginal cost curve, and that's going to occur at this equilibrium point. And we'll then have a price here of PP and a quantity of QP. All right, so now let's look at the existence of this pollution. I'm going to denote the per unit external cost of this pollution with this letters EC for external cost. And it's equivalent to this distance right here, measured on this price axis, which of course is measured in dollars. So what this does, and I'm going to have a simple case here where that per unit pollution cost is the same no matter what level of quantity we're at, okay? So this just shifts the private supply curve up by exactly the amount of EC. If you can see that, that's just a parallel shift up. Now, what does this imply in terms of results? Well, if we were to be able to charge this manufacturing facility for the actual costs of this downriver pollution, they would essentially be looking at this higher supply curve, and the equilibrium of supply and demand would now take place at this quantity. We'll call that QS for the social optimal quantity, and the P would be over here at PS. So note that if we take account of this negative externality, we should be looking at a much lower quantity produced and a higher price charged for each unit of this steel which is being produced. Now, there are several ways that the society can deal with this situation. First, the government can impose regulations on these steel producers and reduce the amount of quantity that they are allowed to produce. Generally, economists prefer approaches that involve more economic incentives for these steel producers. One method would be to impose an effluent tax or an emission charge, various terms for this, basically tax the producers the exact amount, per unit amount, of the external cost. And this will cause the firm to behave as if this is their true supply curve, because in fact it is. They have to incorporate that tax into their pricing structure, and they will then naturally go to this PSQS equilibrium. Another approach, in addition to regulation or tax incentives, is to use a market incentive plan. In this plan, the government would decide what the safe quantity level would be, such as QS, and then firms would compete among themselves to purchase the appropriate, essentially pollution permits that go with that level of production. And that, interestingly, will result in the exact same market solution, PSQS. Now, finally, on your own, I'd like you to think about what this graph would look like if we were looking for a positive externality. Instead of having this supply curve, SP, where would this social supply curve now lie? And what would be the case at the equilibrium between the demand curve and this social, the new social supply curve? What would the price and the quantity be? And how would they compare to the private price and the private quantity? So I'll let you do that on your own.